Well, thanks for joining us again. Last episode we looked at the blame game. I'm suggesting we feel somewhat secure if we can attribute blame and responsibility for problems we cannot solve to someone or something other than ourselves. We rarely feel threatened by problems that have simple solutions, but complex problems like the coronavirus, they tend to threaten and reveal the nature of humanity very quickly. In a speech given in March, President Trump's notes show where the term coronavirus was replaced by a handwritten note labelling it the Chinese virus. Now in early April, the impact in the US far surpasses the devastation that is reported in China. However much we might want to blame someone else for the situation we find ourselves in, at the end of the day, Eve, the matriarch of us all, has stated a truth succinctly and eloquently. Evil exists in this world because there is a power bent on offering us an option B. The Christian narrative makes sense only when we accept the biblical teaching that there is an agent ultimately responsible for evil. And while none of us are clever enough or insightful enough to entangle the complex web of cause and effect, we can know from experience the ripples of unintended consequences. Jesus resisted being drawn into a complex argument about the origins of evil. However, he did in one of his parables make an allusion to the root cause of all evil. When asked why there were weeds among the wheat, Jesus attributed evil not to himself, but to an enemy. An enemy has done this, was the master's reply to the inquiries of his servants. Sometimes it's simple to link a cause with a consequence. If I put my hand in fire, I will get burned. This pain is directly linked to my action. In some cases, there can be multiple degrees of separation, but we can still trace the link. Perhaps a multinational agency has sold cigarettes to a person and the passive smoke contains toxins that promote a dysplastic group of cells to become cancerous. But in many cases, the groaning of creation, as Paul describes it, cannot and should not be attributed to individual agency. At its root, evil is propagated by the cumulative momentum of a millennia of option Bs. Decay and death are all too familiar. And we observed last episode that Jesus did not offer any profound explanations about the origins of sin and evil. Rather, he invested in his ministry in demonstrating his power to rescue and redeem. And ultimately, he collided head-on with death and evil and overcame it. The Christian gospel is not primarily a good explanation of what has been. The good news instead is the good news of what is to come. Jesus beat death and defeated the devil, and he offers all who will believe in him the reality of a life no longer affected by evil or death or decay. Jesus chose not to explain evil, but to expel it. He did not define it, he defeated it. And if we go back and pick up on the first story, we can see the gospel encapsulated in it. God investigates as soon as there is sin. God is investigative by nature. He asks questions to help us understand the big questions. Where am I? In whose territory am I living? Who gives me in my uniform and defines my identity? Who am I listening to? Who is telling me stories? Who is creating my culture? And who is establishing my normal? Who is crafting my presuppositions? Who is influencing my bias? Who is helping me form my default values? And what have I done? How does where I am and who I listen to impact on who I have become? When we truly see ourselves, we will acknowledge that entropy is at work in the universe. Disorder and decay are evident everywhere, and we cannot wish or pretend them away. And as soon as we feel vulnerable, we look to shift responsibility. The man blames the woman blames the serpent, and the serpent, without needing it to be outlined by implication, blames God. But notice in the text that whereas God asks questions of Adam and Eve, does not engage with the serpent other than to pronounce his executive judgment. Investigation and questions imply the opportunity for repentance and reformation. Executive judgment is a final response when there is no further chance of change. The 15th verse in Genesis chapter 3 is often referred to as the proto-evangelon, the first giving of the gospel. And this is for good reason. We are strongly motivated to blame someone else because we are aware that we cannot solve the problem of evil ourselves. It is only those who fail to fully appreciate the complexity of evil that lightly dismiss it. There's nothing to see here can only be said by those who are intentionally deceptive or naively unaware. But when Jesus penetrates deep into our stories, we suddenly become aware that we too have been in the wrong place and listened to the wrong person and done the wrong thing. And I love the story of Genesis because God hears our words but listens to our hearts. We don't realise it, but blaming someone else is a clumsy prayer of concession that we have a problem that we cannot cure. The hero of the gospel story is never us, it is always God. And when we messed up, God turned up and cleaned up. God's solution to our desire to shift responsibility is to accept it. We can't provide a cure. He became that cure. And God took action from the onset of evil to ensure that while evil might bruise us, it will not crush us. God would interject himself into our story, and he would take responsibility. He would instill in every son and daughter of Eve an intolerance towards evil and death. I am no philosopher or anthropologist, but I would suspect there are few on earth today that would disagree with me when I say that the normal response to death and evil is repulsion. Psychiatrists who have no sympathy for a Christian meta-narrative would still agree with Christians that there exists in all of us an unwillingness to concede that pain and death are positive life experiences. We can learn from them for sure. We can become stronger because of them and through them. But most people are unwilling to embrace evil as a desirable human experience. Throughout human history, there have been great thinkers who have agreed that death remains an unwelcome witness to the plight of humanity. We live in a world where entropy inevitably wins. But the good news for those who accept Jesus' teaching and the story of the Bible is that the problem of evil and death, of coronaviruses and of economic embarrassment, is that God has taken on himself the responsibility of dispensing hope. Hope is only a really useful concept when its object is capable of delivering outcomes. We might hope that soap and social distancing are all that are needed to combat the current crisis. But virologists and epidemiologists might find that position naive. Experience tells us that we might also need ventilators, effective quarantine, accurate testing, and the combined power of retrovirals and even an effective vaccination. These might be better objects in which to place our hope, while we still use soap and social distancing as directed. And yet, even with all this and more, thousands have died and are still dying. It is right that we fight back, that we use every available resource to protect us against the invasion of evil into our lives. However successful we may be in our endeavour, we are still all ultimately subject to death. And while it lies within our agency to influence the timing of our demise, only God can rescue us from the inevitability of our demise. God is not amused by our predicament. He found us cowering in the bushes, aware that we are exposed and vulnerable, and that evil has been unleashed and is wreaking havoc, chaos, and death wherever it goes. God investigated and has with precision diagnosed our disease. We have been in the wrong place. We have listened to the wrong person. We have done the wrong thing, and we cannot save ourselves. God did not distance himself from our pandemic. He instead immersed himself with our plight. And Christians around the world are satisfied that Jesus has taken upon himself our disease and beaten it. There is no mausoleum in Jerusalem, only an empty grave. Jesus was raised to life and demonstrated that sin and evil can be beaten. If we change teams and join his side, anyone who believes in him can share in his life and in his victory. This hope, the hope of a reality defined not by my story, but by his story, this is what we will look at in our next episode. I hope you will join us then.